Hi everyone, this is Greg Ford from TalentClick and welcome to today's webinar, How to Assess Sales Talent to Predict Potential and Performance. This is about a 25 to 30 minute webinar and we will record this, by the way, so it will be automatically sent out to you and other registered attendees. Some people couldn't make it today, so it'll be sent out and they can watch it at their convenience. We will be leaving time for Q&A at the end as well, so you can ask those questions via chat. Ideally, if you see that function on the right-hand side in your GoToMeeting or GoToWebinar toolbar, as I said, you can type your question in via the chat function. So let's get started. And I'm just going to briefly show the agenda here for today's session. Some people know who we are already. We have a lot of existing customers on the call, but we have some people who don't know who TalentClick is. So I'll very briefly give an overview of what our organization does and how assessments work. I know some of you have already done the assessment, which is wonderful, and some people haven't. So again, I'll just very briefly explain how it works. But what we'll spend most of the time talking about today is indeed how we identify top sales performers pre-interview stage. And we'll talk about some of the differences. Sales roles are different. Could it be a hunter? Could it be a farmer you're looking for? A customer service representative? I'll explain how we differentiate those different kinds of personality profiles. And of course, it's all about getting results. So we'll talk about some actual gains from using this predictive data. This is me on the left-hand side, and I've got a strong background in psychometrics, psychology, workforce learning. I've taught at a couple of universities. TalentClick does behavioral assessments and psychometrics, but I also want to make it clear, we also have a number of other tools such as 360-degree reviews and corporate culture assessments. That's not the focus of today's discussion. It's mainly about the predictive analytics through the personality assessment. And if you don't know, we serve a number of different industries, everything from natural resources to transportation, manufacturing. We work with hospitality organizations, retail, technology, and they all have one thing in common. They're looking for top performers. These are some of the customers that we have. One of the takeaways from this slide is, of course, the differing industries that we serve. And I want to make it clear, it's not just big customers that we have, these big multinationals in more than 40 countries around the world. We deal with quite a number of small organizations that might only have 20, 30, 40 people. And one could argue that a bad hire for a small organization is actually more impactful than a big organization. We do deal with a number of organizations that have, of course, sales as a top priority. And I think you'd agree that even if you're in, let's say, a more traditional, heavy industrial organization, you still have sales as a priority. Nothing happens without sales. So when you look at your particular organization, who is customer facing? And what are the different roles that you have? They go by different titles. It could be technical sales rep, a biz dev person, customer care, account manager, you name it. And think about the goals that they need to hit. They've all sales targets and quotas for the month, the quarter, and the year. And when we think about those people not hitting those targets or other issues with a bad hire, they can be quite problematic. We might have to fire them, or they might just voluntarily leave. And the cost of turnover is really expensive. According to the American Management Association, it's 25% to 200% of annual compensation. And average annual turnover in sales is about 25 to 30%. It is higher than other departments within an organization. The direct replacement costs for even a telesales employee, so we're not talking about let's say an enterprise level salesperson at a senior level, we're talking about even telesales employees. It can range from $75,000 to $90,000, so big issue. Now, whenever I speak at a conference, I say, okay, put your hand up if you've ever hired someone that you thought was going to be a terrific new employee, and 3 months later or 6 months later, you find out they're not a great employee. Something went wrong along the way. And the problem is we always know it after the fact, after they've been hired. We think we have a good gut instinct, but we don't. The research shows we just don't. So think about these people that you do have on your team who are great sales reps and they love the job. And conversely, the salespeople who had to be fired. Back to the interviewing, I said we have a notoriously fallible gut instinct. The research shows it's actually about a 50% success rate in hiring people who become good or top performers. And interviews are a performance. They really are. And salespeople in particular perform well in interviews. And we can be fooled very often by great salespeople. So, how can we improve this success rate? I mean, there are many tools out there, and we're not saying we are the be all and end all. We're just one of many complementary tools that you can use. Keep doing background checks, keep doing reference checks, do skills testing or simulated exercises or whatever it might be. The issue with those things is they're not always a leading indicator. They're often looking at the past, especially background checks and reference checks. So with personality assessments, they really are about the predictive power, about looking ahead of the future. And they've become very popular. In fact, now 60 to 70% of Fortune 500 companies are using personality assessments in the hiring process. That number used to be about 30 to 35%, so it's doubled in the past 15 years. And part of the reason for that is they've become much more powerful and predictive due to machine learning and AI. And also they've become more affordable with the efficiencies of cloud-based technology. And they've just, as I said, they've become more popular because a lot of organizations are looking for incremental gains. They just keep adding one more piece to the hiring puzzle. If you haven't read any of these books about predictive analytics, you've probably seen the movie Moneyball with Brad Pitt. And of course, it was about using objective data to help find these incremental gains, as opposed to using that gut instinct that I mentioned is notoriously fallible. Now, when we look at interviewing, a lot of people have seen this analogy before, the metaphor of the iceberg, where we look at what we can see on a resume. We can see the experience, the skills, the education. If we interview someone, we can see their appearance and how they speak. We can do the background check and so on. But as I said, salespeople can often fool us and embellish things. And what we can't see with some of these people are what we use, these terms we use to define personality. So it could be default settings or our natural impulses and urges. And this is all about our character. We use hardwiring as another tool as well. It's just how we're hardwired from birth. Another way to think about personality is it's how someone acts when nobody is watching us. Now, here's an important thing to keep in mind with salespeople. It's the difference between can and will. And the easiest way to think about this is with cold calling. We can teach a new salesperson to make calls, and they can do it. And they may do it for a few days or weeks or a few months. But will they do it on their own when nobody's watching? Will they pick up the phone and, for lack of a better term, smile and dial and bang out cold calls time after time? And even if they're being rejected, they won't let that bother them. It'll be water off a duck's back. So that's the difference between the can and the will. And it really is tied to those, as I said, the hardwiring or the default settings in all of us. And another thing I want to make clear, and you'll see me talk about this a bit later, is just because someone's not a good fit for let's say a cold calling role, a sales hunter role, they might be a great fit for an account manager role or a customer service rep. And I will show you some examples here in a second. So at the end of the day, it's about increasing positive events. It could be, of course, just a better sales revenue, the enhanced morale and culture as well, improved employee satisfaction, and so on. But of course, decreasing the negative events as well. So reducing the turnover, decrease the number of lost accounts or customer complaints, and some other outcomes as well. You've already heard me talk about this, so I'm not going to spend any more time on it. When you look at this, what do you gravitate to? What are your natural hobbies, your natural interests? Some people look at this and they think, oh yeah, I'm a huge football fan and I used to play football, or I love the military channel. Other people gravitate to more of those let's say, more introverted pursuits. They love to putz in the garden on the weekend, or they love to just curl up with a good book. And one of the points I'm making emphatically is there's no good or bad personality. There's no right or wrong answer to this question that I'm posing to you right now. This is just how we're born. And it's all about fit to different roles. So some people are a really good fit to be this dominant, hard driving leader, whereas other people are just, they take comfort in just being behind the scenes and going in and being a worker bee every day. And there's nothing wrong with that. We need all kinds in our society. So as I mentioned at the outset, some of you have done the assessment in the past, some of you haven't. If you haven't and you're not quite sure, how we would go about measuring personality, and in particular measuring sales personality, this is how we do it. So what customers can do is they can actually put a link on their careers page, or they can send manually or automatically an email link to an applicant. And then the applicant spends 10 to 15 minutes doing an assessment. As mentioned, everything's online. Our tools happen to be available in 20 different languages because of the customers we have around the world. It's important that these survey questionnaires have a very basic reading level. Ours is at the 4th grade level. They are non-invasive. There's no adverse impact. So we do comply with the EEOC in the US guidelines for hiring. In terms of the report delivery, now, as mentioned, with the efficiencies of cloud-based technology, the reports are available within minutes, and they are stored in the customer's cloud-based portal account for retrieval from someone who did it 2 hours ago, or 2 days, or 2 years ago. So let's roll up our sleeves now when we go back to the agenda and look at the assessments a bit closer. And this is really the meat of the presentation today. So when we look at fit with the job, we call it person job fit, or PJ fit. There's a number of different things that can be measured. And if any of you have a background in industrial psychology or occupational psychology, you might know about the 5-factor model of personality. It's called the Big Five, and our assessments are based on the Big Five. We've put our own spin on things, and we've added a dimension based on achievement orientation, in particular for salespeople. That's very important, and it's different than dominance. You'll see that very first dimension there is someone dominant or non-dominant. That's more about being a leader. You might have someone who doesn't want to lead a sales team. They might just want to be an independent producer, and yet they've still got a very high achievement orientation. So that's what these scales are at the bottom, and I'm going to explain a bit more what those colored horizontal bars mean. Those are benchmarking tools. And it could be, as you see at the top of those gauges, it could be a benchmark for a sales hunter versus a farmer versus a customer service rep, and so on. But this is the summary page from our report. The reports are actually about 7 pages long, but this is the one summary page that's most important. I'll explain these dimensions more in a few minutes. We have another tool which is about work values, and this is more about fit with the organization, with the culture and the corporate values. So we call it PO fit, person organization fit. And you can see there's dimensions here measuring someone's integrity. Does someone take responsibility for their actions? Are they coachable? Do they have a positive attitude, and so on? And I'm not going to spend time talking about this one today. It's a whole nother presentation, but I just want to make you aware that this can be an important tool that can be added into the mix. And this also is generated from that one 10 to 15 minute assessment. It's not a separate survey. It's just a different output from that one input. Okay, so let's really roll up the sleeves here on how do we determine what a great salesperson is, and how do we do that benchmarking that I just referred to? Well, there's a couple of ways of doing it. There can be a job analysis where you have a number of stakeholders and you send a survey to them, and they start ranking and rating how important certain tasks and responsibilities are, or certain character traits. And then all of this can be kind of smushed up through the meat grinder, and we spit out some data on what the aggregate results are for what everyone is saying is most important for this role. So I'm not going to read each of these, but I think you get the point, that this is one really good tool to help create those benchmarks of what a top performer might be. And here's another really good tool. So if you assess your top, I'm just going to take that off for a minute because it'll be distracting. If you assess a number of your current employees, and it could be top performers, average performers, low performers, and then start correlating the results with us. And by the way, our software does all of this. If you start correlating the results of our assessment, their assessment results for your current employees with the ratings that you have, the top performer, average performer, low performer, and then you plot the results on a graph. This is a scatter plot graph where each of those dots or diamonds represents an individual person's score. Now you can see where people are clustering. You can start seeing where low performers are clustering. So in this case with sales, you might see that your low performers are the bottom end of this particular dimension of the top. And these are the people who aren't logging sales calls in the database. This particular dimension might relate to attention to detail or rule following. Are they compliant with the standard procedures you have in your sales department or not? Do they just think, I don't need to log the sales calls in the CRM? Some people always do that because that's the rule and they're very regimented. Other people don't do that. Another example might be in the middle, the follow-up. Some people are always very good about follow-up. They're very conscientious, which is one thing that we measure. Again, that sense of responsibility and attention to detail. And the last one is also a predictive indicator or a leading indicator about sales ability. Conversely, let's look at where the top performers are falling. So the second one in green, you can see there's a bit more of a cluster on the right-hand side. And let's say in this organization, what we're measuring here is achievement orientation. So we're benchmarking the top performers who fall under that achievement orientation, which I will explain more in a minute. And here's another example, the open and outgoing people. So this is the sense of open communication or sociability or extrovertedness. Some people need to be highly, highly social in a sales role. Other people don't. Again, it depends on your particular role and organization's needs. So the takeaway with this is you can start to get up to that 30,000 foot view, and really with the analytics, it gives you that BI, the business intelligence, to start identifying what is the profile, the ideal hiring profile of a top performer in your organization. Make sense? Okay, so what do we do with that? With that I just showed you on the screen before with the job analysis questionnaire, we can start to create these benchmarks. As I told you, I've explained what these horizontal colored bars mean. So the one in red, we could allocate that to a sales hunter. So this is someone who makes those outbound calls, and they have to be highly metrics oriented. And you'll see on the first dimension, non-dominant versus dominant, a sales hunter has to be pretty dominant. They have to be driven and assertive. So you can see that range is quite far to the right. Whereas you see the yellow bar is actually more in the middle, and that could align with your needs for a customer service representative where they don't have to be super dominant and aggressive. All right, so I think you get the point with this. By the way, the starburst, the red and white marker, is the score for an individual. So you can see this particular person falls inside the benchmark range for sales manager, which is in gray, and the red, sales hunter, but outside the range for an account manager or farmer, and definitely outside the range for a customer service rep. So if you put this particular applicant in a CSR role or a account manager role, they may go squirrely, they may get antsy, it's not challenging enough for them. Whereas the alternative individual, if you put them in a sales hunter role where they had to be highly aggressive and dominant, they would get uncomfortable with that and probably feel that imposter syndrome and get de-energized by it and quite anxious, and probably within 3 to 6 months you're going to notice that their performance is suffering. Here's another example. You can see a few of the different dimensions on here, not just the first one. You can see what it looks like when we add in a few other things, such as the the contented, reactive, reserved, and so on. And so at a glance, the gauges at the top can tell a recruiter, especially a younger, unsophisticated recruiter, just at a glance, they know, is this person a good fit for this role? Well, yes, 95th percentile or 95% fit for a sales hunter role, but only a 65% fit for sales farmer or CSR. Here's another example. This is more for retail. This is an actual example from a customer of ours. So they wanted one where they could overlay results for 4 different roles and see, is someone a good fit to be that customer-facing sales associate, or are they a better fit to be in the back room just handling inventory? And they also wanted to know, is this person, in terms of succession planning, a likely fit for a store manager role? And in this case, this particular applicant, probably not so much. They're only about a 40% fit for a store manager role. Here's one that we did for insurance. This is actually for State Farm in the US. And they have, excuse me, they have 18,000 agents in the US, I'm told. And we created a benchmark for these agents and the different roles that they have in their agencies throughout the US. Okay, so just at a glance, they can tell who is a fit for what roles. And we actually had one of them say, this is helping me identify diamonds in the rough, because I work in a relatively small town and I don't have a huge applicant pool. And so before I started working with this tool, I might automatically dismiss or reject a candidate that came in for an interview because they just didn't wow me in the interview. Well, again, keep in mind, interview is a performance, and some people don't perform well during an interview. Well, it turns out this agent didn't need them to be super, polished and outgoing and, a dynamic individual. This person became an excellent account manager and is one of the best little diamonds in the rough that he's ever found. That's the feedback from that individual. Okay, I told you the reports were about 7 pages long. Here's another page from within the report. This is a page for interviewing. So there are personalized, tailored interview questions for each individual person. So the results change, the questions change for each person depending on their unique results. And this again becomes a powerful tool for interviewers or hiring managers, instead of the usual, tell me about your strengths and weaknesses. It becomes this tool where they say, do you remember doing that 15-minute assessment? Well, your results show that you might score a little bit low on, let's say, you're very direct. You can be too blunt sometimes. And in a sales role where you're a hunter, sometimes that's necessary, but I'm looking for a great account manager. I'm looking for a customer service or call center rep who is just super, super friendly. So you tell me, how have you learned to manage your directness and your bluntness? And then the candidate is sitting there in the interview thinking, wow, they know that about me. I can't bluff my way through this. And that type of personalized behavioral interview questions can be translated into reference checking questions as well. Okay, so I just want to make that clear that this is a powerful component of the reports. So moving on to the second to last stage of this webinar is actual looking at the results. And we'll break it down dimension by dimension, especially as it pertains to sales roles. So that first dimension, the dominant versus non-dominant, you've heard me refer to that a few times in the last 10 minutes, but this is the individual that, as I said, the dominant person loves taking charge and leading, especially if there's let's say, a team of individuals for a bigger sale, a more enterprise level solution. There are other people who get nervous and anxious if they have to lead a team. And as mentioned, that might be okay for your sales role if they're an individual producer. Let's look at contented versus achievement orientation. And this is universally important for almost any sales role. It doesn't matter whether they're a hunter versus farmer CSR rep. They have to have a high sense of achievement. Now, the benchmark range would show that it's probably a little a little higher for that hunter and metrics driven salesperson than it is for CSR, but still important for CSR. So if we break it down a little, you can see people that are a little more contented prefer to work in a role that has goals that are fairly easily reached. They don't enjoy working under pressure to achieve difficult sales targets. Whereas the person on the right, they are motivated to reach challenging goals. We use terms like they've got the fire in the belly, or they're self-driven. They just, you give them a target and they just love going after that. And there's that inherent sense of reward, and they provide their own, as I said, fire in the belly to reach those goals. The recognition can be just attaining those goals, but often those kinds of individuals love recognition from the sales manager or organization. And you can see the photo of somebody receiving a certificate or plaque. And that's how to motivate some of those people. Reactive versus calm. So the calm individual, you might think that's always necessary. It's actually not, especially for salespeople. The one on the left, reactive. So this is someone who scores on the left side of this particular dimension. And usually when there are deadlines and targets, you kind of want someone to be a little bit anxious and proactive and have that sense of urgency. And so surprisingly, a lot of the top salespeople score quite far to the left side of this dimension. They're not always calm. The calm ones are often thinking, yeah, don't worry, something will always work out. We'll reach the target. Whereas that reactive individual, they might hit their target 1 month, but then the calendar flips over to the first of the next month and they're back at it thinking, I don't know how I'm going to meet my target this month. And often that's what's required in a top performing sales role. Reserved versus outgoing. So as I mentioned before, often in a sales role, you need someone to be outgoing and social, but not always. If this is a telesales role or someone who's just working remotely from their home office and they really don't need to be meeting with someone, it might be quite fine for them to be reserved. And you get that highly outgoing individual that might go stir crazy just sitting working from their home office all the time because they need more social interaction. And talking on the phone doesn't always do it. All right. So this is an important one that's really tied to your sales roles, and it's important to benchmark for your organization what that person job fit, the PJ fit might be. Hope that makes sense. The one on the right, the outgoing individual, as I said, often, but not always, they do love that, the hunting, the cold calling. They love talking to people all day long. They get energized by it, whereas that reserved individual, it can really drain their tank talking to people all day long. And that's what personality is. It's usually, especially with this dimension, which is tied to introversion, extroversion, it's really about what energizes us. And often people misunderstand introverted people. They think introverted people don't like others and they're antisocial. That's not the case at all. It's more about where do we get our energy from? What stimulates us? And introverted people can recharge and stimulate the battery, if you will, by isolated or solitary pursuits, by reading a book or going for a walk on their own. Whereas that outgoing individual, the extroverted person, come Friday at 5 o'clock, they want to be out with other people on the town. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Direct versus empathetic. So once again, it depends on the role in your organization. Empathetic individuals are always quite sensitive to the needs of others. They can be more tactful. And this is important in these helping roles, especially a customer service or call center role. And we see this in retail and hospitality all the time as well. Nothing pleases these people more than delivering a great customer experience. And You've heard this when you call up your local telco provider or your bank or someone. We all know when we're talking to someone on the other end of the line that just seems to really care about our experience versus someone on the other end of the spectrum, more that direct individual. It doesn't mean they're a bad employee. It just means they may not have that sense of empathy, and they're much more direct and forthright. And that can be just fine for that cold calling role, where if they get rejected, as I said earlier, it's water off a duck's back. And they can just be much more assertive. And if you're a sales manager, constructive criticism for that individual can be much more blunt and direct. You don't often have to sugarcoat things the same way you do for an empathetic individual. Okay, we're almost done with these. The last little bit here, spontaneous versus regimented. Spontaneous individuals are flexible and improvising, so they often prefer to work in a role that has an element of variety and unpredictability. They like to think on their feet. They don't enjoy performing repetitive sales tasks, and they like the flexibility in how those tasks can be completed. The people at the other end of the spectrum, regimented people, are more rule-abiding and detailed-focused. So this can often work better for a more established traditional organization, whereas we deal with, let's say, some tech startups, some software startups, where every day is a new day, and they just don't have those the predictable routine with the set procedures and so on. Things get changed up all the time. So this is a really important one for recruiters to figure out, because often they'll have turnover because someone will get into the role and think, it's just too boring for me. It's too predictable, and there's no sense of spontaneity and trying new things. Or the alternative person who's quite regimented and, let's say, a little more bureaucratic, shall we say, may not fit into that tech environment because their world is rocked every day and they need more predictability. Okay, hopefully that one makes sense to you as well. The last one, conventional versus open-minded. So conventional people also enjoy that predictability and love the established processes, and the open-minded individuals are much more imaginative and open to change. So again, this is closely related to the last one. They like the developing new ideas. If you need a salesperson that needs to be a problem solver and think outside the box, this is an important dimension to pay attention to. They often will be creative, and they often will think with their gut, and you can involve them in strategy. Whereas other individuals at the conventional end, they don't really want to think about strategy. They just want you to tell them, here's the sales target and here's how to hit it. You do this, you do that, you add water and stir, and you're going to get the results. And these kind of people take comfort in those rules and procedures, if you will, on the conventional end of things. All right. So as I mentioned earlier, does it work? Absolutely. It's it's all about where the rubber meets the road and delivering results. So here's a quote. I'm not going to read it, but it's from the #1 producing State Farm agent in the U.S. So we're told, and I think it was year over year, or if not, then it was at least the #1 person in one of the past 3 or 4 years. His name's Kyle Angel from Houston. And yeah, you can see that it's definitely helped this individual grow his business, along with many of the other State Farm agents. You heard me earlier mention that from that 10 to 15-minute assessment, we produce a number of reports. And I mentioned very briefly that we've got this work values and attitude, which helps with person organization fit, the PO fit. So that's more about fit with the culture and so on. I said we don't really have time to talk about this one today, so I'm only going to show one quick slide. And here's a close-up of what the summary page looks like. And you can see all the individual markers. That's the the orange and white starburst markers. And then the green boxes are the benchmarks for this particular organization according to their needs for a customer service role. Okay, so you can see how everything that I've just talked about with benchmarking can be applied to different tools, including the work values and attitude assessment. Okay. So that's it. We've come to the end, and a few of the takeaways for this is we all have different personalities. Personality is definitely predictable and measurable. And when we do it right, you can get the right salespeople in the right jobs, and it will absolutely help you with those positive outcomes that we've talked about. It will help you get those top people in the jobs who deliver more sales, and they last longer in the job, so it helps you reduce your employee turnover, helps reduce the internal conflict and management headaches that you might have to deal with as well. So lots of outcomes that are positive for finding those salespeople that are the right fit for your particular job and your organization. Okay, so there's my contact info. Best to email me. You'll see the gford@talentclick.com email address. And we're at the half-hour mark. We're just a couple of minutes over, so my apologies for that. I'm going to open it up to questions here, so I'm going to have a look at the chat function. And by the way, if you have to go, because I know you probably only scheduled 30 minutes for this, feel free to log out, no problem at all. You're not going to hurt my feelings. As I said, this has been recorded and it will be sent out to you and other registrants as well. But if you don't want to log out and you do have a question, as I mentioned, feel free to type it into the chat window. I'm just going to be silent a minute and look and listen. And I'm also going to stop recording this.